Hello and welcome to episode 9 of Lunch and Crunch, or perhaps not, as Danielle has informed me.
Yeah, hi, I'm Danielle. I was getting ready and my husband was like, "Oh, are you doing lunch and munch?" And I was like, and he was like, "That's wrong, isn't it?" I was like, "Yeah, that's wrong." It was like I said two food words.
But I mean, that's it. I mean, once we're done, just it's going to be ASMR of us just eating food constantly. That's what the show's going
Yes,
to be.
extreme close-ups and extreme like into the microphone chewing. So
It's
if you like chewing ASMR, then then this will be the show for you.
and definitely not the show for people like Dixie, who that would be the worst thing ever.
Yeah.
But speaking of our lunch and munch, what are you having today?
Well, I'm going to be having bread and cheese, uh,
Ooh,
but not in like a poor person in the 1800s. All I can afford is a wheel of cheese and a loaf of bread kind of way. Um, but instead in a bougie American, I went to a store that only sells cheese, uh, and bought a couple of different fancy cheeses from there and have been snacking on those for my lunch. So
nice.
it'll be a lot of cheese and a lot of bread.
I feel like there's a whole topic that's unrelated to our content of talking about how food starts off as quote unquote lower class things because it's necessary and then slowly becomes super exciting.
Yeah, like lobster.
Right. Because actually, like, just to jump to mine, I actually made a grilled cheese and bologna sandwich.
Oh yeah.
But fried bologna is very much a southern staple, as I'm sure you're aware.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
But it's becoming super trendy in Georgia right now to have like upscale fried bologna sandwiches.
Really?
Yeah, oh, yeah. Like we went to one place. It was like $15 for like, I mean, it was like bologna that was like got from a specific butcher and it was handmade and like the bread was all like custom baked and like the whole 9 yards. I mean, it was as possible to get elevate each of those ingredients as possible, but it's still $15 for a fried bologna sandwich.
I mean, I remember making fried bologna sandwiches because there's literally nothing else in the house to eat.
Right?
O- Or the dreaded just bologna on bread for lunch
Oh
because
yeah.
it's packed in a lunchbox for you for school, and so you can't even have it fried. Uh,
I used to hate bologna because of that for the longest time because that was
oh
my only
yeah,
experience with
same.
it. It was like just okay, well, it's bologna on white bread and it's like
Yes,
nothing else. Maybe
with some
maybe
mayonnaise.
oh god, yeah. Or Miracle Whip.
Just like, oh no, even worse.
And I was like, none of this is good. And then I found out, oh, actually, bologna
You
itself can actually
could.
be really, really good if it's done right.
Well, that's like spam too, where
Hmm.
people are like, "Oh, fried spam's so good," and I'm like, oh, "You can keep your fried spam over there."
Yeah. Um, Ian just posted that prisoners were so sick of being fed lobster every day it was considered cruel and unusual punishment and demanded they not be fed lobster more than once a week.
Yep. Yeah, there are laws in Maine about not feeding prisoners lobsters more than once a week.
Really?
Yeah,
That's wild.
because of that very thing. And because lobster is just so abundant and cheap up there, like you throw out a net and you've got a dozen lobsters, like just done. But
I mean, that makes sense. Whatever's, if that's the commonly available food, then eventually you're going to get sick of it no matter what.
yep.
So, what kind of tea are you drinking today?
I am drinking Harney and Sons English breakfast tea. I needed something a little stronger than my normal fare because
Mm,
I've been having some sleeping, like sleepy sleepies. I don't know what else to call it. Like I'm often nappy in the middle of the afternoon and then I go to bed early and then I wake up late and I'm just sleepy all the time. And normally in the summer, like that's normally a winter problem for me.
right.
In the summer, I'm like, oh, it's warm outside and I like that and I want to go outside. And I did take the dog for a walk yesterday,
Nice.
but it was, yeah, it's just, I don't know. So stronger tea for make sure that I am a more alert chatting partner today.
Which I appreciate.
Yeah.
I'm actually going the opposite route because I have, for a while, I was doing kind of similar boat. I was having more caffeinated tea because I was struggling in the mornings, and I forgot that the caffeine spiral, which is that you drink more caffeine and then like around 2 p.m. you crash,
Yes.
and then nap occurs, and so I was like, okay, the only way to get out of this is to go back to decaf.
Oh yeah. I mean,
But sometimes you ride the caffeine horse for as long as you need to.
well, yeah, that's why I just recaffeinate in the afternoon, and then hopefully by the evening I'll crash and just go to sleep.
And so, yeah, that would be another way. I won't say a smarter way, but definitely another way of handling that problem. But so instead, I am drinking red velvet chocolate from
Oh,
the Republic of Tea. It is let me pull up the ingredients list here. Rooibos, is that how it's pronounced? Rooibos, Rooibos.
Rooibos. I think that's correct. Yeah.
Sounds right. But it's that with some beetroot, sweet blackberry leaves, and then natural chocolate and vanilla flavors. And it tastes like a red velvet cupcake. It's actually really good.
Yeah, I like a good rooibos. And yeah, those are nice decaffeinated teas, so you can drink them at any time of the day without feeling like you've charged up your energy tanks.
I mean, generally I have it like as a nice dinner tea because it's a good kind of dessert. No caffeine, so it won't keep you up. But I was like, nah, I'm feeling like I need something nice for myself right now. So,
Right, right. Well,
but anyway, as much as we could do an entire hour about food and food anthropology.
we could.
Super cool, interesting me. But today we're going to talk about narrative permissions and, to a degree, kind of what we've been calling universality of tabletop role-playing games. So I think probably let's start is kind of let's talk about definitions. So for you, when we're talking about that universality, what are you thinking?
Often, I consider things that all games tend to share. If, how do you identify a tabletop RPG? Well, it's something you're playing pen and paper or, around a table with friends. But clearly there's more to it than that because then board games are tabletop RPGs, which I've seen some bleed of calling board games tabletop RPGs in certain
Yeah.
circles. So, not that. So, what makes a tabletop RPG a tabletop RPG? And like, I think things like having a specific character that you're playing, creating that character from scratch in some fashion, and then the game itself has rules for interacting with the game world, interacting with the other player characters in a more free-form manner and less structured manner than, say, a board game. I mean, there's a lot of other things to it as well. So, we think about having some kind of combat system or system that allows you to determine success and failure. Combat, success and failure, investigation or perception type things, success and failure, or say diplomacy, socialization with NPCs. And often that success failure is in some way determined by a randomizer. And it could be, I have a lot of examples of things that don't use standard randomizers. We think of dice as the pretty standard randomizer, but, you could use cards in some places use like skill-based randomizers. Like Dread uses a Jenga tower, but that's still a randomizer. So there's some kind of randomizer. There's some kind of way to determine success and failure. And the actions that you take in the world are more reactive to what's going on, the situations around you. They're less prescribed.
Mm-hmm.
So in a board game, there's, prescribed actions that you're taking.
Right.
And maybe you're playing cards out of your hand, or you're doing all sorts of different things to determine how you play the game. But the game itself has a lot of structure to it, a lot more structure to it than tabletop RPGs.
Right. And one thing we should probably kind of dig into is definitions from a design perspective, particularly in games, are really, really hard. Even though game design as a field has been around explicitly for about 20 years now, there's still not a standard definition of a game, let alone a tabletop role-playing game. So every time you come up with some kind of definition, there's always going to be exceptions. So obviously, there are diceless games. There are games that have no randomizer whatsoever. There are games where you only have pre-generated characters and you can't make your own character. There are going to be all sorts of exceptions to all of these. So we're not saying that every tabletop role-playing game must have these to be considered a tabletop role-playing game. Rather, we're talking about trends.
Yeah, absolutely.
And well, I was just going to say real quick, to kind of, as an example, you were talking about how this differs from board games. If you think about like Monopoly, you're playing the role of a real estate investor, but also the amount of things you can do inside of a game of Monopoly are, like I said, very, very prescribed. It's very much, you can only do certain things. You go around the board, you can buy properties, you can sell properties, you can trade properties, but you can't like blow up someone else's house. You can't intentionally commit fraud and you steal someone else's money to buy a property. There are certain things that would theoretically fall in the root of real estate investor, but a tabletop role-playing game generally is a seat of, it tells you what you can't do and then gives you everything else inside of that, whereas tabletop board games are much more, this is only what you can do.
I don't know about you, but when I play Monopoly, I play the role of a shoe. So I don't know about this real estate investor thing you're talking about.
I am frequently a dog, surprising absolutely nobody.
Sometimes I'm a hat.
Wow, fancy.
Yeah. I like hats, so.
But I know, at least for me, part of the reason I got thinking about universality as a concept was when you started talking about, and then actually ran me through an example of what you call chaos RPG. So maybe kind of talk a little bit for people who aren't familiar with that.
Yeah, so I had an idea one day that proved to be true, which was that all games have such universal interactions that are normal between all games. And I say all. Mm-hmm. Again, most. That the interactions between these games are universal enough to where I could pull characters from any game system and have an entire game session with them all together from different game systems and run that game pretty flawlessly. Mm-hmm. With whenever it's time for your character to take an action or to do a thing, or you want to do something, you use your character's rules for whatever it is you're doing. And then you tell me, or I adjudicate the success or failure of that thing. Mm-hmm. So if you were using a diceless game, which I absolutely had somebody in a second session I ran of that running a Noblest character, which is a diceless game. And so when they wanted to do a thing, thankfully I know the rules for Noblest, so it wasn't so difficult, but I adjudicated based on the rules that determine how they interact with the world. Mm-hmm. And so even with a diceless game, I was able to have characters interacting and and playing the game pretty seamlessly for what they were trying to do. And I think that the universality of games is something that I like to say that the rules are made up, that they don't really matter.
It's like Kuzaza anyway, right?
And that is right. And that is true to a certain degree. Now, the rules do matter because, again, I think I've talked about this before, which is that based on whatever rules your character comes from, whatever rule set or whatever game system your character comes from, that game system has a set of rules that tell you how to play your character and what your character should be about. And based on that, people's characters were focused on different things based on what part of the game their game focused on. So, you know, the Monster of the Week character wanted to investigate a lot, where the My Little Pony character that you played was all about social interaction.
Right.
Because that's the most important thing to that game system. So,
yeah, and I think that,
yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
No. That's it. Like it proves that everybody could play the same game using different characters from different games, because we're all kind of playing the same game in a certain sense of we're all agreeing to the social construct of what a tabletop RPG is.
Right. And I think that's a really interesting point, in the sense that we've repeatedly said rules obviously matter, but what they matter for is actually not immediately obvious. Like when you get into the basic level of design, it's okay, every rule I put out, it matters. Not only the rules that I write down, but also rules that are a little more implicit. But you know, sometimes rules you don't write down are still just as binding. But I see the video's lagging. That's weird.
Yeah, it was happening last time too, and I don't know what's up with that, but it hits, we'll have a little bit of video, and then I notice it start lagging. I didn't know if it was just me or if it was the stream itself. It looks like it's the stream itself.
Yeah, I'm noticing it too. Well, we'll just plow on and see how things go.
Yeah.
But not only do we, you know, the rules matter, like as far as going, you know, you have to write the rules down, but there is one of the implicit rules that come up specifically for tabletop role-playing games, and to a lesser degree other game designs, depending on what genre you're developing in, is how is this game similar to or different from other games I have played? And obviously that's the very idiosyncratic, specific, you know, you can't design for that because each person will have a different experience of what games they have and haven't played. But for the most common example, a lot of times people will pick up a new role-playing game and they'll be comparing it consciously or unconsciously to things like D&D. You know, usually that's kind of a good gateway game. And so it's like, oh, this game is like D&D except for blah. To the point where some people actually even pitch it as it's like D&D except for these changes, or this is different from D&D in these certain ways. But you had talked about kind of how also the narrative rules of worlds are differently approached in this kind of construct. And so I think it's a good segue into kind of narrative permissions. You know, there's a different kind of rules, but they're still rules, but they're a different set of rules, and that they're also tie into this universality.
Right. Narrative permissions are essentially the things that the game tells you you can do with the tools that it gives you. Most are implicit narrative permissions. So if there's a skill or an ability that says, you know, like might or something like that, then your skill with, you know, your ability, your attribute, whatever it is, implies that the higher that rating is, or the better it is, the stronger your character is, right? The mightier you are. And there may be some explicit examples of what you can do with a higher rating in that. And there may be some implicit extra things that you could do that we don't really talk about. They're not codified in the rules, but you could say to whoever's running the game, hey, I have a really high might. Can I do X? And at the moment, the person who's running the game, who has a kind of handle on, okay, what are the narrative permissions of this game? What is the narrative permission of that skill or ability or whatever it is? Okay, yes, you can, because that falls within that range of what that narrative permission should allow. And some games give really explicit narrative permissions. I talk a lot about Powered by the Apocalypse games as being a really good example of where the narrative permission is the game. And if you don't have a move available that gives you a narrative permission to do a thing, you kind of either you can't do that thing, or you do that thing without needing to roll. So there are certain things that are narrative permissions in PBTA that are very clearly, your character is skilled at doing this. You don't need to roll. You just do it when you ask if you can. And then there's things that are moves that are, there's risk of failure. There's risk associated with this action. And therefore, we're going to, go through and we're going to make sure that, okay, we're going to roll and we're going to see, do you succeed or do you fail? But if you don't have a narrative permission, i.e. a move to do a thing, just can't do that thing.
Right.
And, that's kind of writ large in, I like to use Masks as a game that has a really good set of narrative permissions that really exemplify what the game is about. You're teenage superheroes, you're not regular superheroes, and so there's a way of interacting with other characters that depends on whether or not that character is an adult or another teen. And if it's another teen, you can just do social stuff with them, no problem. But if they're an adult, you can't lie to adults. You can't even try to lie to adults.
Just bad at it.
Because you're bad at it. You're so bad at it is you can't even try to succeed. And you can't manipulate adults. Teens are bad at that. And so there are no moves for it, and it's a thing that you would risk failure on, but there's no moves for it. Because you're teenagers, you're twerpy little kids who aren't good at manipulating anyone other than other twerpy little kids. And so there is no narrative permission to do this because that's not what the game is about. And I mean, you could create a move and add it to the game and it would still play just fine. But that's a game that's telling you what it's about and what's available in the narrative permissions.
Right. And like you say, what narrative permissions get presented and allowed do shape the game. So, an example actually of this was when I was working on the World of Darkness MMO, there were a lot of people. It was a 100-person project at its peak. So there were a lot of people who weren't very familiar with Vampire the Masquerade or even Vampire the Requiem. They were just coming into this only from their knowledge of other vampire media. And one of the things that I remember one of the animators did was they actually created an animation of a vampire flying. And this prompted a big meeting. It's like, vampires don't fly unless they turn into a bat or some other kind of flying creature, but they can't just fly through the air. And the animators in question, well, we're bringing up videos from other vampire movies that we had said these are good touchstones and showing examples of vampires flying. And it was one of those examples of it was not an explicit narrative permission. Nowhere does it say vampires do not fly. I take that back. I think there might be something buried in the fiction in second edition that says something to that effect. Because there's in Dracula's letter, there's a kind of things that vampires can and can't do. But it's still pretty obscure. And also we were referencing 20th anniversary issue, which I don't think referenced that document. So it was a case where the people working on Vampire the Masquerade understood the implicit vampires can't fly narrative thing. You do not have permission to fly unless you have very specific power. Whereas everyone else is like, well, in all this media, it looks like they can, so it implies that I do have permission to fly. So that was a case where, okay, we probably should have made that clearer in some points, spell out that assumption.
Right.
So when you say, like you said with Power of the Apocalypse, it's one of the rare games where it says, unless stated otherwise, you cannot do a thing. It's much more board game in that regard, like we talked about earlier.
Right.
Here are the list of things you can do. And that's actually one of the things that took me a while to wrap my head around Powered by the Apocalypse's design. Whereas something like Storypath, it's much more, unless the rules tell you you can't, the answer is maybe.
Yeah, give it a try.
It's pretty common for a lot of games. But then that's where also the story guide, knowingly or unknowingly, ends up kind of making their mark on the game. Because when you have... I tend to think of narrative permissions in yes, no, or maybe terms. Basically, the rules saying, yes, you can do this thing. No, you can't do this thing. Everything else, which usually involves dice rolls, is in the maybe area. And that's kind of a pretty wide range. So what you define as maybe and how you define maybe as story guide allows you to shape that game. With Aberrant in the tone rules, we made that a little more explicit. It's like, okay, if you want a game that feels 4-color, these narrative permissions are now in play, and this is how the rules change to address those narrative permissions. If you're doing deconstructionalist, it's a very different set of narrative permissions. You can't be as open, but for example, four color rules, you can't kill people. That narrative permission is taken off the table explicitly. You cannot kill people because that's not what this genre now allows. Deconstruction, you absolutely can kill people. So that's the difference between, say, the Batman 60s show and The Boys. They're both superhero, but they're very different in tone because of different narrative permissions that are in play.
Right.
When we keep saying that narrative permissions are rules, but they're not always mechanics. I think that's what we're kind of getting into.
Yeah. Narrative permissions are sometimes just you can do X thing, and that is a thing you can do. And then the mechanics that back up, what does that mean? And so sometimes narrative permissions have mechanics that back them up. This is what that means whenever you can do X thing. And sometimes they don't. And that's okay because you can often adjudicate what a narrative permission is or what it allows you to do without a mechanic. It just lets you kind of freeform make up what that means on your own.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the games that we were having a conversation about when we were writing this up was Exalted.
Yep.
Where in Exalted, especially second and third edition, when you have a very powerful thing, it gives you charms that give you narrative permissions.
Mm-hmm.
Big, sweeping narrative permissions are very powerful in the game.
Mm-hmm.
Where charms that give you dice adders or extra dice things or bits here and there were lower level abilities. But those narrative permissions don't really have a mechanic backing them up. There's no, what does it mean that you can create a plane of existence that is different from creation that you sweep everyone into, and now that is the battlefield that you're fighting on.
Mm-hmm.
Right? But that's a big thing that you could do. So it's a big narrative permission to change the landscape. So it's a powerful thing. It takes a lot of it's, you know, a higher essence ability, or it might be a capstone to a set of evocations, or it might, you know, that sounds like a pretty beefy power. But as the GM, when I'm looking, you know, I'm looking at this as the storyteller, I'm saying, okay, but what does that mean?
Right.
Are you, you know, and it takes somebody with a lot, you know, creative energy to make that meaningful, because the game doesn't necessarily give mechanics to make it meaningful. Sometimes it does.
Mm-hmm.
But in a lot of cases, the narrative permission itself is the thing that is the power.
Right. And it's not necessarily good or bad, but the trend in design has been more towards giving mechanics for those things.
Yep.
A good example of this, if you want to kind of see on a timeline what that looks like from a design perspective, is the D&D Wish spell. Looking at how the Wish spell is written in various different editions of D&D. Early editions, Wish is basically just, you can wish a thing into existence. It gives you some very light mechanics, but they're pretty vague, and pretty quickly a lot of people abuse that to the point where it almost became kind of a meme or a cultural touchstone of game masters finding ways to interpret literal wishes in the worst possible way to introduce some kind of balance to this extremely vaguely worded spell. Yeah. To get to like 5th edition, where Wish is almost like a checklist, like it can't be more than a 9th level spell effect, it can't do this, it can't do this, it can't do this. So there's a lot of very strong restrictions on that to kind of ramp that down. So it's still on some level, you can do a thing now. You can do it once, and within all these limitations. But it's still, like you're saying, it's like there is this kind of drift in design where the more powerful thing gets, the less the randomizer or the determiner of justice failure kind of comes in. Just, no, you can do a thing now. But power and removing mechanics aren't necessarily in lockstep. There are certainly in video games, for example, the reverse I found is true. There's a game I played recently called Shotgun King, which is actually a really cool game. It's a chess game, but basically the premise is that you're playing the Black King. Everyone else in your army has left you, so you're just the Black King with a shotgun trying to defeat the White King in a chess game. So you can move one square or you can shoot your shotgun. But each time you clear a board, you get a choice of 2 cards. One card is a positive thing, a new thing you can do. I can now I add more ammo to my gun. I can increase the amount of spaces I move, whatever. But then also there's a thing that the enemies can also do, which is like there are now 3 more pawns on the board. Pawns can move backwards. So these are very kind of, from our potential, narrative permissions in the sense of like, okay, you can now do this thing you couldn't do before. And that's how the game builds up, is ultimately, it's a roguelike, really. It's the game evolves each time you play, and these random rules keep coming in, and they shape that experience and shape they open up what you're able to do. But the actual...
The game sounds hella cool, actually.
It is. It's like $6 on itch.io, or I think it's going on Steam in the next few days.
Excuse me while I go buy Shotgun King.
Shotgun King, yeah, no, absolutely. But I mean, I like looking at video games and comparing them to tabletop role-playing games, because sometimes you can learn a lot from going in both directions, right?
Oh, yeah.
Really, with video game design at its core is you can't do anything unless you specifically tell the computer, I want the player to be able to do this thing. Tabletop role-playing games are the opposite. You can do anything you want to until the rules tell you can't.
Right.
So they are complete opposites in terms of core design. But when you get into the space of what can players do? It's helpful because humans are so creative or also overwhelmed with choice to limit their options makes for better games. Whereas in video games, the goal is to have players have as many options as possible. You know, it's considered to be a good thing if you have open world games, or you can take things in any order, or your choices matter and persist. These are all things that are counted as benefits to video games that are considered to be just assumptions in tabletop role-playing games. And you have to actually, okay, but you can't just go absolutely anywhere. You can't, all of your choices don't necessarily matter, because ultimately, you know, on some level, you have to do what the rest of the group wants, or you have to go in the vague direction of the plans that the game master has.
Right.
So where I'm kind of going with that is that that's where narrative permissions come in, is because they help to constrain and define a game where literally anything's possible as long as the people at the table agree that it's true.
Right. Yeah, and that's, you know, I like looking at video games in the sense of they just lost my audio.
I don't know. Yeah, try. I like video games in the sense of and no audio. I can hear you.
I mean, if you can hear me, then it might be on your end. I don't know.
Well, we'll keep going. We'll see if people are still not hearing audio. Okay, you're back now. Okay.
Okay. Wow, that was weird. This whole stream has been weird.
Yeah. Not.
That's fine.
I can't even give you credit for it this time. It's somebody.
Nope.
I think Twitch is just maybe having an overload problem or something.
Maybe. I see Asmongold is doing some kind of Q&A chat, so, you know, he's just overloading the Twitch. Damn you, Asmongold.
How dare you?
Anyway,
so you like video games.
Mm-hmm. I like video games in the sense of narrative permissions. We talk a lot about implicit and explicit rules. Narrative permissions are one of those ones that fall fuzzily outside of explicit rules and often into implicit rules. But in video games, like you were saying, the narrative permissions become explicit.
Right.
And tabletop RPGs can take a lot of direction from that by making narrative permissions explicit. Mm-hmm. And saying what exactly can you do and what exactly can't you do, and permitting players to take actions, and making those narrative permissions as explicit as possible, so that it really defines the sense of the game. Where, you know, when you say, okay, this is permitted, or this isn't permitted, and you wind up with a really tight game of what people are going to do in the game because they know what they can't do and they know what they can do. Mm-hmm. And that may create some implicit rules, clearly, if there's nothing but here's what you can't do. Right. Rules tell you can't do X, Y, Z, but you can do literally anything else. Then all of anything else that you're allowed to do is implied. Right. But again, you know, that idea of taking cues from video games where you have to define what people can and can't do. Like, oh man, I was playing Outriders. Now, that's a great game. I love it. It's a cool story. I like it. It's an over-the-shoulder third-person shooter, which makes me kind of ill in the sense of, well, I get motions. Yeah, I get motion sick pretty easily, and it's got some motion blur
Yeah.
issues. But I love it anyway, despite that. And but you can't jump in that game, and that drives me freaking nuts.
Mm,
Like, let me jump, okay? Like, I want to be able to just hop a little.
right.
Even if it means nothing, even if it does nothing for me, please let me hop
Mm-hmm.
in a game. And it's interesting to me that I never realized how important it is to me to be able to hop or jump in a game until I couldn't.
Yeah. Or if you play a PC game, particularly older PC games, where your your 3D movement is not mapped to WASD keys. And that's
Right.
really frustrating because we've so established WASD is how you move around. And so it's like, no, use the arrow keys. It's like, well, I could see the logic of doing that, but we're not used to playing things that way.
Yes. Yeah. Now my hand is in a completely different location on my keyboard. It's weird.
And it goes back to universality, right? Where it's the if you don't specify what your narrative missions are, people are going to go based on their old tabletop experiences, and that they're going to fill in the gaps that way.
Yep.
So you mentioned the My Little Pony character. I brought it up partially because I was trolling, to be honest. But I was like, there are no rules for dying in this game. Ergo, I cannot die. And because it was a funny game, I took that to a ludicrous extreme and assumed that my character had no concept of death, even though in My Little Pony characters do die. But the point is that in this tabletop role-playing game, it was not, there were no explicit rules because they were assuming people playing the game were not going to lose their characters in that fashion. So it's like,
Right.
we're just not going to present rules for this. So the implicit narrative permission is characters don't die. That
Right.
does not mean death does not occur. But because there was no explicit discussion of that, I took the narrative permission to a humorous extreme.
Right. Right.
So if you, like for example, if you don't have a combat system in the game, unless you address for some reason why there is no combat system in the game, people will find ways to punch each other in the face. There's a game which I keep citing this in both the Pathcast and here, and it's a shame because it's a really good game, but I think ultimately it didn't survive the Kickstarter and it's not available anywhere else. But the John Silence game, where they basically took classic Dungeons and Dragons, old school Dungeons and Dragons, and mapped all the combat systems to social interaction. So instead of hit points, you have heart points, and you use different kinds of attack as different rhetorical devices.
Right.
So you basically, your job is to convince people to see your side of the argument, but you can do that aggressively through strength. You can do that nimbly by dancing around the issue through dexterity, so on and so forth. And there's a note in there basically the fact like this replaces combat. If it gets to combat, people are going to die. You hit them once and they die. You know, it's much more of the, you narrate that side of it because this is how conflicts result in this game. And I've seen other games, something similar, where it's like combat is either particularly deadly or somewhat meaningless. So we don't spend much time detailing combat. Instead, here's what you use. But if you
Right.
don't say something like that, then people who are familiar with other role-playing games will assume this is an error.
Right.
And you'll see reviews like, this game is missing a combat system.
Yep. Yeah. When we think about narrative permissions and universality, you're right, because if you don't tell people that this thing that they assume is universal is available, that they're going to wonder where it is, and they're going to try to figure out how to do it regardless of whether or not your game is built for that. Hello, D&D, and dozens of people running D&D as social game simulators, and they make it work and it works just fine, but the game does not suit itself well to that kind of stuff. But there's no specific, in fact, there's an implied that you should be able to do these things decently well because the mechanics for making a social role are exactly the same as making a combat role, except there's all this other involved stuff in combat, like hit points and, what happens whenever you're at 0 health and how do you die and all this kind of stuff that doesn't exist for the social side of things. There are no social hit points. There's no back and forth between social interactions. It's just a straight up pass fail, as with, disarming a trap or leaping across a chasm. It's as complicated as that, which is it's not. Right. And so if you wanted to simulate a back and forth social interaction, the rules just don't allow for it. And so I'm always surprised when people, I'm not surprised because, again, just like I can run any game with any system, and people can have fun, right? Even if the system doesn't support what we're doing. People are going to have fun at their table no matter what the rules are telling them. And that is also a universal truth. They're either going to have fun because they're having fun with their friends, doing a thing that they want to be doing, or they're not going to have fun because something bad happens at the table that has nothing to do with the game. And they might not have fun because your game sucks, right? Like that might also be true. But the universality of your systems means that you can do anything using any game system, if you're willing to work for it. And so it never surprises me, but it always disappoints me when I see, we're running a Regency romance game in the D&D 5th edition system, and I'm like, oh, really? That's a choice.
Right. But I mean,
I bet you're having fun.
Yeah. But I mean, the thing is that this was objectively proven in the kind of the D20 era, right? When the opening game license first came out and everything was converted to D20. We even had a World of Darkness game set in D20. But there was I remember Big Eye Smallmouth had a D20 thing, Mutants and Masterminds had a D20 thing, Call of Cthulhu had a D20 thing. There were all these things that go, you can make it D20, so it can be done. But generally what people found when they played these versions, it doesn't quite feel the same. They can really always articulate that. And what was happening was that you reach a point where either so much the system has to change to address the narrative needs of each game that it stops resembling the game it's supposed to resemble, or it's the way that the things the system does well change the narrative focus away from what the game needs to focus on. So again, Call of Cthulhu, having a nice strong combat system is good for certain flavors of Call of Cthulhu, but at the end of the day, you're not really going to do anything meaningful against Cthulhu. You're not going to do anything meaningful against the Elder Gods. So having a combat system doesn't really mean much. So it's a lot of going through the motions of something that isn't necessarily needed. Whereas Ian points out Trinity had D20 adaptation. And I think that one was actually pretty good because a storyteller was pretty action-adventure in the Trinity iteration, and D20 is action-adventure. So that was a pretty strong mapping, and it worked decently well, especially Adventure D20, I remember, was actually particularly well received. So when you get something like Story Path, you can theoretically do a lot of things with Story Path. But there are, if you were to port, like you could do a fantasy game in Story Path very well. If you were to do D&D specifically in Story Path, there would be some changes. Like we talked before, the swinginess of D&D would go away because you're just going to succeed more often. That's just what Story Path does well. D&D doesn't have a concept of failing forward that Story Path does. So that's going to change the D&D experience. And some people would argue that that would be a better experience to them because more of a story path is doing maps to what they want to see out of a game. I know some of our colleagues have expressed frustration about how D&D works because you can just roll a die and fail. But at the same time, it doesn't change the fact that it's not exactly D&D anymore. So like you're saying, with universality, any game can be run in GURPS, as GURPS has tried to prove over 3 decades.
Right.
But it's not the same game.
Right.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was going to move us forward to, connecting these things, which is that, when we talk about universal, and we talked about this early at the beginning of the show, but when we talk about universal things in a game, the universality of games is that what we see is a lot of indie games that are pushing the boundary of challenging universality in ways that remove those systems. So diceless games, games without combat, games that are all about social interactions, games that use randomizers that are out of the box, things like that. And those games are all everything I can think of as a good example of those kind of games are really clear with their narrative permissions, so that they're making it very clear that no, there is no combat in this game, and when there would be combat in this game, you do X instead. And they try to make it as clear as possible, because if you don't make that clear, people will just assume and make their own implicit rule that there should be combat, like you said. Oh, it's wrong, there's no combat system. Or they'll use the basic system of the game to simulate combat in some way.
Right.
Because without being told, no, you don't get into fights in this game. Anytime you would get into a fight, you wind up making out instead. Right? Like,
yes.
I'm going to make that game eventually, but but when we do that, you got to be very clear, and let people know that. Otherwise, they're going to assume they can get into fights. Or, if the game is nothing but a combat simulator, or, what is it, the game that you were telling me about that's like wrestling, and you solve everything with wrestling. So like,
oh yeah, worldwide wrestling, yeah.
Yeah, so like, oh, we're gonna have, we're having a social scene. Okay, well, there's a social conflict. We solve it with wrestling. It's literally everything is solved with wrestling, even things that doesn't make any sense to solve with wrestling.
Right.
Get solved that way. And that's explicit in the rules, because otherwise people would be like, how do I handle the social aspects of this game? Okay, well, the rules have told me I handle it in this way specifically. So if you're making a game, and you want people to be able to, or don't want them to be able to do certain aspects of what they expect to be able to do, you really need to write that into your rules of how that functions. Right. Either that they can't do it, or that it functions the same way as some other aspect of the game.
And some of those are implicit, right? Which is what we talked about earlier. Like superhero games. Most superhero games do not tell you this, but it is implicit into the nature of superhero games that most of your problems are solved by combat. I mean, yes, you can have a lengthy conversation with Dr. Doom or whatnot, but eventually you're going to punch him in the face, and that's what's to be expected. And sometimes you can break them in interesting ways. So like Morkborg does some pretty good stuff by taking D&D style games and really stripping it down as much as possible, and just saying, yeah, we're just going to give you an extremely loose system, but a ton of flavor. And you have to really bring a lot to fill in the gaps, both narratively and design wise. The game works just fine, but it does not help you in any way, and that's the point. The point is like it gives you just enough to get going, and then you fill in everything else, and it becomes your game at that point. It's very punk rock in the sense of you fill in the gaps, you make it yours. Right. But the whole game hinges on implicit narrative permissions. You could do whatever the game master says you can do. Right. And a lot of that's going to come from what people expect. But also, this goes back to our conversation on tropes. Tropes on some level are narrative permissions, and when you tweak those, you get a different experience. I'm thinking right now, I've been watching, I was pretty ill last week, and so usually my comfort food is either sci-fi or superhero shows. So I was watching a bunch of Japanese superhero shows like Kamen Rider, and so of course, naturally, there's a long moment where the character changes form, and you get like 15 or 30 seconds of that change scene, and then things continue. And there's one moment where the bad guy was in the process of changing, and the good guy just attacked him and punched him in the face, and everything kind of stopped. Like everyone was just stunned by this. It's like, you can't attack someone during a transformation sequence, but no one was saying that, but they were violating an implicit rule. It's like, you don't do this. Combat takes 6 seconds, except for when you change form. Then it takes however long it takes. And we do this all the time. Like, okay, the combat stops while the villain gives a monologue speech, or the players have a long speech, and say, there's no way you could have crammed all those words into the game mechanic designated 5-6 seconds or however long a turn is. I know story path, we kind of dodge that, but we try to avoid giving a concrete time amount, so simply to allow for, okay, if it makes sense that on your turn you do a thing that's longer, you have the time to do that. But at the end of the day, sometimes I know people will take, this power says it takes a scene or an hour, this power says it takes a scene or 30 minutes, this power says it takes a scene or 5 minutes, so what is the actual time length of a scene? The answer is, but when you take those assumptions and put them together, sometimes people bring their different implicit narrative permissions to the table, and like you're saying, unless the game is simply breaking that in some way, you need to spell that out.
Right, exactly.
And you need to be able to do something. I'm trying to think of, outside of combat, if there's anything else like an indie game has done recently. Well, I mean, I suppose even story path, one of the things that I know some people still trip up is a sense that you can't actually fail.
Yeah. Failure is still, something still happens on failure. Right.
And it's something that some people have really struggled with, the sense of, or even like in They Came From, where you get more powerful as you get damaged. Again, that's another subversion of an established universality. Most people, the universal thing is the death spiral, which is that the weaker you get, or the more damage you take, the weaker you get, which means you take even more damage. And I remember Matthew and talking about this, is that not only is it a weird design, in terms of it actually makes it hard to do things, but also in movies, that's not what happens usually. The character gets more competent. But that was something we had to spell out. Yes, this is intentional. We're doing this more effectively.
Yep. So if you have any questions or things that you want us to say out loud,
right.
Go ahead and put them in the chat, and we'll try to answer some things. We're getting close on time, but I'm having, sorry, I read a thing and I'm like, I'm confused by this question.
So Not a Digit asks, what's the question problem? And in case you came in a little bit late, and also we had some technical problems, there isn't really a question problem per se. Generally speaking, how these episodes work is we talk about a concept and dig into it. We're talking specifically about how a lot of tabletop role-playing games generally have universal working parts, and how if you don't explicitly talk about how your game differs from those universal parts and what things you're changing rules-wise. People are going to bring their own assumptions to that game. And we're using narrative permissions as kind of a way to differentiate rules that define what you can do inside the game world versus more explicit mechanics of here's how the dice work and here's how you take damage. They're still rules, but for our discussion, we decoupled those to make those a little more clear. So that was what this was all about.
Thank you. Because I was like, how do I explain what we just talked about for an hour?
Fair enough. No, an episode of Ian says an episode of Dragon Ball Super has Android 17 blowing up some Sailor Moon type heroes mid transformation sequence. Oh, okay, cool. So other media have also kind of been like poking fun at this.
Yeah.
And bit of a digression, but I find how these things get entrenched interesting. So like, for example, the words campaign and initiative all stem from tabletop games, wargaming roots. It also, where we would play like Napoleonic campaigns and use rules to reenact those. And so tabletop role-playing games were a step removed from that. And now here we are 40 years later, but some of this stuff is still kind of entrenched. Similarly, for anime and tokusatsu, when someone gets defeated, they explode. But a lot of that comes from Kamen Rider, specifically the 70s version, because the characters, the organization that created them, built in a device that if they were defeated, they would explode so they wouldn't be captured. And it just became so cool looking that everyone started applying that exploit that narrative bit. So now just people randomly explode, because that's what you do now in these things.
Very amazing.
So, the idea of roll initiative, right? It's kind of almost a shorthand for we are now getting into combat.
Right.
What if your game doesn't have initiative? What if the initiative works differently? So it's interesting. It's interesting.
Yeah, and I never thought about it before until now that everybody kind of knows the word initiative, and we use the word initiative in most games. So I think Exalted Third Edition instead uses the term join battle.
Right.
Because initiative is instead this like resource that you spend and you gather when you're making withering attacks. And then you spend it in decisive attacks and you take it from other people in attacks. And so the initiative is literally that word, like taking the initiative. And so it's interesting to me that I never even thought about that, how close we are to initiative as a word that means a specific thing, because I think a lot of people trip up on third edition Exalted because that word initiative is being used in a different way than what we're used to.
Right. And so you have to over-explain it.
We have Not a Digit says that they're used to playing Amber Diceless. He's asking what's the problem. Amber Diceless also has a bunch of narrative permissions in it that are very explicit in there, and you can't do certain things without those permissions. So just because you have a diceless game doesn't mean you don't have a game with a lot of explicit rules that tell you how to interact with the world around you.
Right. But if that's the game you're primarily familiar with, then Amber Diceless is much further away from most tabletop role-playing games, and so you'd be missing the universality part that we're talking about.
Yes. So somebody Iron Warrior X has said, Cortex and Fate lean pretty heavily into narrative permissions with distinctions and aspects. I've found that I've become attracted more to those very narrative systems. Are there any Onyx Path games that lean heavily into that more loose idea? I think, honestly, Scion is probably the one that leans most heavily into narrative permission based on your path is and your callings are kind of descriptor words. Right. Especially for Scion, your path is kind of a descriptor word, and they give you a lot of narrative permission based on what your descriptor word is. And they allow you to contact people and do specific actions that make sense within the description of your path. And I think that, you're going to find Scion, the Scion game line has a lot more leaning into that narrative permission as opposed to the very hardcore, not hardcore, but the hard-coded, that's the word I was looking for. Thanks, brain. Very hard-coded narrative permissions and explicit rules that you find in, say, like Trinity. Right.
And also, I mean, part of the reason why I think Scion works that way is because the world works by narrative logic, and the game even tells you that. It's like science and physics don't rule the worlds. The mythological structure does. So we have a game where the world works by narrative logic. It makes sense that the game itself is going to be a little more narratively defined. By that same conceit, I would say that games like They Came From East to Sea and its ilk are also in a similar vein because they work by movie logic. But that's a comedy game. So, I mean, it's meant to be, when you apply narrative logic ad hoc, the humor that results from that. But you could play them straight by just saying, okay, it's working movie logic, but we're not sending up those concepts. Then I think that works out really well, too.
Yeah.
And also, Ian pointed out, Cavaliers of Mars Demos system is also kind of, because you're defined by things like for honor, for love, and for self. And so when you're trying to punch someone in the face, you can do that for honor with force, or you could do that for love with grace. And those are two very different roles, but the same result is the same. So again, much more flexible in that regard.
Yeah. Man, I forgot all about that. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ian.
So with that, I hope that folks found this interesting. It was definitely one of our more esoteric, I think it's fair to say, episodes. Yeah.
Less crunch and more munch.
See? Lunch and munch it is. It's how it all ties back together. All right. So with that, we will be back in 2 weeks with another episode, and we will catch you all later. Goodbye.
Bye.